Thanks for tuning in to the 168 Podcast, a podcast from Mitchell Knight and Jordan Bird of the Clarence Church of Christ, aimed at helping you connect Sunday worship with everyday life. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Jordan, what are we going to be talking about today?
So I ran across a tweet by someone on Twitter, and I don't know, what am I supposed to say? It was a tweet on Twitter.
I know, but that's what a tweet it's just what a tweet is. I'm sorry.
Anyway, I ran across the tweet on Twitter. Okay, I ran across the tweet. There, we'll leave it at that. By a guy named Jeff Pearlman, which I don't really know much about him other than I think I've run across him, I think by a book he wrote, because he's a New York Times best-selling author, and so he's wrote some sports books and just some books I've heard of before, so I think that's kind of how it ended up in my feed. But he basically retweeted and commented on something that the Georgia Bulldogs account put out, and basically it was about the accident that happened recently where a player and one of the training staff were killed in an accident, and I think a couple other people were injured, and
I know 2 were dead.
Still hospitalized or still in need of care. And the Georgia Bulldogs account basically gives the statement from the athletic director or athletic association from Georgia, but then it's also encapsulated with, "We are heartbroken over the passing of these 2 people. Our prayers are with their families during this difficult time." And so Jeff Pearlman, the person who tweeted, "This really tore me up today, and it also got me thinking about the God answers prayer, quote unquote, line that actually has started to," he uses other words, "tick me off. Damar Hamlin survives, and we're told it's, quote unquote, the power of prayer." Then he goes on to say, "Then these 2 young men senselessly die," talking about the 2 from Georgia, "and we need to pray to God for strength, even though they already died. And if we question anything, it's, quote unquote, you just have to believe in God's plan." He goes, "I'm tired of it. So tired, I think is what it's supposed to say. Why would God's plan even put Hamlin in the hospital? Why would God's plan end the lives of these 2 people? Why did 30 people die in a Russian attack on a Ukraine apartment a complex yesterday? We're not supposed to doubt any of it, just, quote unquote, God's plan. And if you just mindlessly follow, you're deemed holy. And if you question any of it, well, how dare you? Truth is, I don't think God exists. I think awful things happen, and maybe we'd be better off just understanding that life is random and weird and often upsetting. I don't know. It just all got to me today." So this stuck out to me just because I think, for me, it pits these 2 understandings of God in relation to real world events against each other to some degree. And I like I said, I don't know this guy. I don't know much about his life, but the way I read his words, I don't think he's trying to be mean. I think he just honestly doesn't know what to make of the 2 things. And for him, it's like, it just seems like it's nonsense. It's two worldviews that collide that don't make any sense. And so I'm just kind of stay where I am. Like, it's not even worth me investing thought in who God is, how God operates, any of that stuff. That was my initial response from it. And my I guess takeaway or view is, I wish he could see it in a more like nuanced way, I guess, because I think he has been presented a perspective of God and how prayer works, or what prayer is, and how prayer functions in the world in which we live, in a way that kind of puts it in a box, and it's not outside of that. And it's very much like God says everything goes, and anything that is bad is still part of whatever God planned, and it's all just God. Like, there's no other actors involved. It's all God, and we're just crying out to God to fall on our side of things, or something along those lines. And it just seems very, is nihilistic the word I want to hear? Like, it just seems pointless, like, from his perspective. Like, what kind of God is that why would I pray if that's how God is? It's just sort of like whatever he wants. And like, this person I'll keep alive, these 2 people I won't. And like, it just seems very random from his perspective. And so Anyway, I thought it would be a good jumping off point to talk about some of the things that come up in his statement about who God is, how God interacts in our world, how prayer is a part of that, how we view what happened to Damar Hamlin and his recovery, and then what do we do with like two people that die and don't have the same outcome that Damar Hamlin had. So what are some initial thoughts that you have, or what sticks out to you from what he said?
Well, the first thing that sticks out to me is that our plan of having a decoy table for our cats is not working. The second and third and fourth and fifth things are what I'm actually going to be talking about. So I think it's just a bad take, and I don't hold it against him. Obviously, I think it's something that he's struggling with, but this ultimately boils down to the same conversation that people have all the time. And it starts with a question, how or why could God let this happen? Why was this part of God's plan? But mainly the first question, how could this happen? Why did God let these people die, in Ukraine? Was it like Russia and Ukraine, that one?
Yeah, that was the other example you gave.
The real question is, why do we keep choosing to do these kinds of things? Why do we keep killing each other? God isn't orchestrating some kind of massive plan of death and chaos for some greater purpose. God's plan is actually to limit himself, to not micromanage us so that we can freely choose him. When it comes to the player and the staff member at the University of Georgia, it simply comes down to, in my opinion, that you and I take risks every day. We know deep down in our subconscious somewhere, when we step behind the wheel of a car, there is a chance that we could get into an accident and that we could die. If that happens, that's not on God, that's on us. If anything, it's an entirely different situation from the Damar Hamlin situation, because there's this horrible thing that happened to Damar, which everyone saw, and then the intercessory prayer happened, and there was a response to that. I think what you can take away from the Georgia situation is, look, death, accidents, these things happen, but we also take risks that we're responsible for, because that's what it means to be alive and to live life. We have a will. We take chances. We choose one thing or another, but we also have to be humble, and we have to understand maybe the next time we get behind the wheel of a car, we should maybe pray a prayer for safety, or we should ask for God's help or his provision or something like that. I mean, again, I think it ultimately comes back to this idea that, again, God's plan, we're not put on this giant timeline, and we're not these cogs in a machine that just happen to work out in a certain way according to the way that God wants it. God doesn't want any of his children to perish before they have a chance to repent. Peter's letters to the church kind of sum up that idea. Unfortunately, that is one of the risks of living in the world that we do and with the free will that we have, is that things like this happen, and it's unfortunate, but it doesn't mean that God isn't any less present, and it certainly doesn't mean that God planned for it to happen. But it also doesn't mean that God cannot use this tragedy for some kind of good purpose down the way. We really can't imagine how that happens, but God didn't orchestrate this, but he can still use it in some way, as tragic as it is, for the good of other people. So I think I'm kind of rambly, but I basically got across the few points of, like, I think it's different from the Damar Hamlin situation. We have free will. We choose to put ourselves in risky situations. When we end up dying because of it, it becomes God's fault. And then when we commit evil in the world by, like, murdering other people, essentially in Ukraine, that's also God's fault. Well, really it isn't. It's actually ours. It's what we choose to do. And God is actually the one who is able to take those broken pieces and kind of shape and mold them into something better for his good and glorious purposes. So I hope that makes sense. This is just kind of my raw reaction to it. I haven't really, practiced what I was going to say or anything like that, but these are just some of the things that I think about. So,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd say pushback to your point, but like, there's probably some distinction of there are some situations that are directly our participation in the negative thing happening in our life. And then there's other situations like a car accident, which involves a whole lot of actors. People driving, the people around them driving, the circumstances that led up to it. Like there's a whole bunch to take into consideration to say who or what was to, quote unquote blame for that situation. And, part of, I think, the issue this guy has is that he's comparing two situations which aren't exactly apples to apples. One was about someone who did survive, essentially dying on the field and coming back to life by resuscitation. And then the other one is the two people die. And the point about prayer isn't about like praying for two people who are dead. It's praying for the people who are still alive. So it's a little bit of a different situation. And I think he seems to be caught up in two of them die. So why does prayer have to do with, like, it's almost as if prayer only has to do with someone if they live. And to go back to the Damar Hamlin thing, this was one of my observations with how prayer was being thrown around with that whole situation. And I'm very much in belief that I think prayer is powerful and effective. It's something we're called to do as followers of Jesus. Like I'm not trying to downplay that, but at the same time, I mean, this isn't what happened, and I'm grateful that he is back to seeming like he's on the road to recovery and all that. But had he not got to where he is now, would prayer still be spoken about the same way as being worthwhile? I think it would have been like, see, praying is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Look what it doesn't do. As if it's like punch in this code and it works or it doesn't work. And that's not what prayer is to start with. And so, I mean, we talked about this in the episode where we talked about the Damar Hamlin situation, how prayer almost seems, it's more almost like a thing that's like when you don't know what else to do, that's what you did. And that's what I think you saw a lot of people doing, was they didn't know what else to do. It was between nobody knew anything. Nobody knew really what had totally happened on the field. Nobody really knew what was happening at the hospital. So there was this big cloud of unknown. And when there's nothing we have any information about to be like, well, the doctor should or shouldn't have done this, or the training staff should or shouldn't have done this. Nobody knew any of that. So what do you do in a situation like that? We're not used to that because we usually feel like we have some semblance of control or say so in a situation. And in this situation, just seemed to be different for a lot of people, or almost every person, in that there was nothing to grasp for other than, I need someone who can do apparently more than what I am ever capable of doing or anyone else can do right now, and that's God. No matter whether you thought of God in a personal sense or some higher power or whatever, that was my read of what happened. And it seems like for this guy, there's someone, or at least somehow in his life, he's been given a perception that an answered prayer or an unanswered prayer, or like someone living because of prayer or someone dying in relation to prayer, means that God just is like the puppet master, like controlling everything. And it's just, to me, it's just a limited perspective of who God is, how the world works, and how prayer fits into that. And my wish for him is that there'd be, he'd have a little bit broader perspective, or be given a little bit, maybe connecting of other dots to things, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Because to me, and again, I think part of it's he's comparing two situations that aren't the same, because
that's my thing.
The Georgia thing is they're making a comment about our prayers are with their families during this difficult time. So just because they died, does that mean now prayer isn't effective for them? Yeah, that's kind of what he's saying without saying it. And I don't, again, I'm not really blaming him, because he's coming from a worldview where he already doesn't claim to say that this is how he would approach things anyway.
Right. And I think what you're saying is probably something I should have brought up. That prayer isn't entirely just this transactional process. The whole idea of like answered or unanswered prayers are kind of strange to me, because certainly, like you're saying, prayer is powerful and effective and God does mighty things, but there's also this formational aspect of prayer where, like we're saying about the Damar Hamlin situation, no one knew what to do, no one had any information, so they decided to pray. They decided to connect themselves with something that was greater than themselves. And that changed them. That gets them in communication with who they should be in communication with. The whole answered and unanswered prayer thing is almost looking at prayer from the wrong mindset. It's not, it's almost like we're only putting the emphasis on the request and the receiving part of it rather than the humility part of it, the, I can't do this kind of part of it, the humility part of it. And I think it just serves a greater purpose than just, well, if God doesn't give me what I want, then, he's not really there and he's not answering my prayer. It's like, well, he's still there, he's listening. It's more of a communicative process. It's not like you're going to a 7-Eleven to buy something kind of process. It's something different than that.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how to really communicate my thoughts other than just giving a reflection of, I wish he could have a broader perspective of
same
than how it's been portrayed to him, I guess is my point. Because it just seems like he's been given this perspective that God just controls every jot and tittle of life, or like every instance, as if there's no agency involved in any people whatsoever.
Yeah, that was my main point that I just took issue with. I mean, again, we know we're responsible for our actions, but I think ultimately it comes back to what you were saying, that the two situations are different. And again, the prayer is not for the dead people. It's about for the people who are mourning the loss of their loved ones. And God's actions aren't limited to just resuscitation or death. It's like the whole, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek. I mean, God is present. That's a big part of it. I mean, he's with us, and he comforts us, and that's a big part of it too. Just him being present and knowing that we're in right relationship with him is something that goes way beyond just getting what we want or asking for what we want.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing I think I would not really push back on what you said, but just this perspective that he conveys, or that someone has conveyed to him, is, I mean, you hear this, I think a lot of people hear this often. I mean, it seems like it even came up with the Damar Hamlin situation of, God's got a plan kind of a thing, as if like tragedy is purposeful in that regard.
Yeah.
And I think you already mentioned it. It's not that God can't use a tragedy for something good, or
but
like
he doesn't plan it to happen.
He is the one who can bring redemption out of a mess. Like, we do believe that's who he is. But I think ideally he wouldn't want there to be a mess to start with, have to make something redemptive out of it.
Right.
Like, I think that's fair to say he didn't create the world messed up to then have to redeem it all. Like, it was made good to start with. That's the worldview that we as followers of Jesus and those who are looking toward God's revealed word hold to. Like, God made all things good to begin with. And it fell apart when humanity in the world separated from God, and then it spiraled out of control from there. Like, how every web of it connects together, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. But there was a sense of goodness that was there, that's where God started, not with a mess. And then it seems like the telos, or the end result, is to be like that, if not even better than that, which is even hard to believe that it could be better than what it was when it started. But perfection is what seems to be what we look forward to. And again, that it can't be perfection if even then there's some sort of like messed upness that then so God can do his like making it better thing. And again, but that's not to say that God can't do something good out of a bad situation, because that is the hope that we have on this side of eternity, or this side of death, is that life can seem very crummy, but yet God could still do something good out of it. Not that he wanted to have to do that. I mean, we could look at just the very situation of, Mike just talked about this in his sermon this past Sunday, of the agony that Jesus goes through in the garden of like, I don't want to do this. I really, really don't want to have to do this. There seems to be a sense of, really, this is it seems like this shouldn't be what I have to do here. Like, and he's wrestling with the like God perspective, the human perspective. Like, it seems like there's the desire of like, this shouldn't be how it should have to be, but it is what it is. and God's trying to make something good out of it. And that's what happens in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Like, there is new life and resurrection life that comes out of it. And so, yeah, just this whole notion that like it's God's plan for everything is just, it just seems like I've heard other people say this, but it's almost like you're setting your perspective of God up like a house of cards, because the next time that the hard time comes and you feel like God's just punishing you in it, the whole thing just comes crumbling down. And then you're like, well, maybe God isn't real. I mean, you start down this whole path of questioning everything when it's like that shouldn't be the foundation it started on to start with.
Yeah.
It should be started on Jesus and the hope that we have in through him and what he wants to bring us to eventually, but not right now is not the standard, I guess, is ultimately kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. I think sometimes that gets said because people are trying to be helpful and like give like, you know, I think they're trying to say something good could come of this, but when you say it, you know, God's got to, you know, it's something like it's part of God's plan.
It's part of God's plan. It's like,
the language itself, I don't think is helpful in how we perceive and interact with God then, because then it just makes it sound like God just wants us to go through bad stuff, which isn't to say that there isn't a sense of us going through hard stuff that can make us better. Again, like we even see that in Hebrews where it talks about Jesus learning obedience through his suffering, essentially.
And he, like, you know, it says he promises us suffering. Jesus promises us that we will suffer and be persecuted, but he doesn't say that he's the one that causes it. It's because the goalposts are kind of messed up, right? It's because, well, you're going to be hated because you're going to represent me, which goes against everything that this corrupted reality stands for. I mean, it's a cause and effect thing. But, yeah, I just go back to the, you know, how could God do this or how could God let this happen? It's like, why did this person choose to do this? Why did this have to be this way? Like, you know, so many times I think the example, you know, I went through in theology is something like, you know, a drunk driver hits and kills, like, you know, a little girl. It's like, well, this is part of God's plan. It's like, no, it's not part of God's plan. God didn't want the drunk driver to get behind the wheel of the car and kill the little girl. And then when people say, well, how could God let the little girl die? It's like, well, why? How could this man decide to get behind the wheel of the car drunk? And then that ultimately comes back to, well, I mean, I could have done it. Anyone else could have done it. We all make mistakes, but they're mistakes that we willingly choose to make because, again, this reality is messed up. And again, yeah, God can use it for his good purpose, but it doesn't mean that he creates it for the good purpose.
Yeah, and I get to some degree there can be a questioning of like, why does God not stop or hinder certain things? Like, I get asking that, and that gets into a whole other like, or I guess merely back to the whole, do we want a world where people don't have choices, or where everything's just like padded and provided, and you don't actually get to, again, you don't have agency or interaction in it. You just sort of do what you're programmed to do, and that's that. And as much as I think we would enjoy not having the bumps and bruises and all the things that come with life, I think we also find value in the agency that we have.
Yeah.
That's part of what makes us a living human being, or a person, that we get some say-so over life. And that comes with the good and the bad, unfortunately. And part of it, the bad comes because we've separated ourselves from the wisdom of God to begin with.
Right.
And I don't know, I was thinking about while you were talking, and I'm not sure if this is well said. I mean, I would probably need to think about it further, but as much as the language of like, it was, we say something was part of God's plan, I wonder if a better way to be able to say, I wonder if a better way to say it is, it happened and now it has become part of God's plan, only because now that it's happened, God has to work with what the world gives him to, in the process of him bringing it to redemption. Not that he wanted to do it. That's not what we're saying, but it's now there. It has happened. And all of those have happens. God is somehow able to eventually bring to new, recreation, new creation in the end, which is just mind-boggling when you think of all of the, now this has happened, that is horrible things that have happened in life. And how can God make something good out of that? Like neither you nor I can do that, but God promises to. And we see that happen first and foremost in the life of Christ who is resurrected. When, now that this has happened, now that he's been put to death, now that has become, it was like, there's, again, we have to go back to the God sees things broader than we see thing too. It's, for God, it's not a now and then now as much as it's sort of like the whole thing, but we almost can't like fathom life from that perspective. But yet the seeing it all at one time also involves all the actual agency choices that are made by people throughout that whole process, which again is just like mind-boggling. That's why God's God and we're not. That's why we shouldn't try to be God either, because we are incapable of doing a lot of things that need to be done in the world. That's why we need God. That's why we need Jesus, who's revealed God to us. And so I think if I had one encouragement going forward is not to not say something in a time of hardship in someone's life, but to maybe just pause and think about the language you're using to give hope to the person in the midst of it. While I think the intent might be to offer some hope, the language we use does communicate probably more than we think it does sometimes. And I think that's what happened with this person, is they were given a perspective that the person probably meant well. They're taking hope in that they think God's got things covered. That's what they mean by God's got a plan. At least I'm guessing that. But it also conveys a worldview broader than that to people who don't see life quite from that perspective. And so my caution would be, maybe take a moment to think through like the language you're going to use for a situation like that. Or get some perspective from someone else to maybe help you give an answer that's not just sort of, well, I don't know what to say, so I'm going to say this. That might have more damaging ramifications down the road than we hope or intend. And I don't think that's the intent of most people. But it might help mitigate some of that. I don't know. Do you have any other takeaways you can think of from our conversation?
Yeah, that would just be the practical takeaway. Just be careful about what you say. Words have power. Yeah.
I think the other thing I would say is a worldview matters.
Yes. Because again, it's the whole house of cards thing, right? Because if the God's plan perspective is what you have, then like you're saying, when something horrible happens and you can't really see what the good of it is, then everything could fall apart. But if it's based on something else, if it's based on the presence of God, if it's based on the work of Jesus, then it's really hard, impossible for that foundation to be removed. So that's what I would encourage you all with.
And I hope also we're not coming across, or me specifically, as if God doesn't have a plan, because he does. The overall plan is to bring as much of the world as possible to be included in the new creation. And that's the hope that we have. And there is a plan. It's just, I don't think it's micromanaged in the way that it gets communicated in a lot of different situations. So anyway, I thought this thread from this tweet would be an interesting conversation. So hopefully it's helped you think, it's helped you to think about the worldview you have, the way you perceive God, and the way you interact with prayer in relation to the things that happen in the world, especially some current things that have happened most recently. So thank you for tuning in to this episode, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.